The crosshairs trembled slightly in the scope as Sarah Chen adjusted her breathing. Rain droplets streaking down the lens of her Remington 700, 347 yards away, through the fourth-floor window of First National Bank. She could see Dr. Amanda Foster's terrified face pressed against the glass, a gun barrel pointed directly at her temple. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 12 hostages had been trapped inside for 6 hours, and the negotiator had just gone silent. The hostage taker was escalating, and Sarah had maybe 30 seconds before he started executing people. Lieutenant Harrison's voice crackled through her earpiece, dripping with doubt even in this moment of crisis. "Chun, you sure about this shot? Because if you miss..." But Sarah had stopped listening. She'd heard those doubts for 18 months straight. Today, they ended. 18 months earlier, Sarah Chen had walked into the Riverside Police Department carrying a duffel bag, a military discharge certificate, and 8 years of Army sniper experience that nobody seemed to care about. At 28, she'd already completed 3 tours overseas, logged over 200 confirmed hits, and trained half the snipers in her unit. But according to Lieutenant David Harrison, head of Riverside's tactical response team, military experience didn't translate to civilian police work. Sarah had grown up in Riverside, Colorado, the daughter of a nurse and a high school math teacher. Her parents, David and Linda Chun, had immigrated from Taiwan when Sarah was 2, building a quiet life in this mountain town of 85,000 people. Sarah had been the kid who spent summers at her uncle's ranch, learning to shoot cans off fence posts with a .22 rifle while other girls her age were at dance camp. By high school, she was winning state shooting competitions. But even then, people questioned whether someone her size could handle the recoil of military-grade weapons. The Army had been different, or at least she'd thought so. Her drill instructors cared about results, not assumptions. When Sarah consistently outshot men twice her size during basic training, she'd earned respect through performance. Sniper school had been brutal, with a 90% washout rate, but Sarah had finished 3rd in her class. Her spotter, a guy named Jake Morrison from Texas, used to joke that Sarah had ice water in her veins and could thread a needle at 1,000 yards. Those 8 years had shaped her into something precise, disciplined, and unshakable. She'd learned to calculate windage adjustments in her head, to remain perfectly still for hours at a time, and to make shots that would determine whether her unit lived or died. Her commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Williams, had recommended Sarah for advanced sniper instructor certification just before her discharge. The colonel had written in Sarah's recommendation letter that she possessed a rare combination of technical skill and mental fortitude that made her one of the finest marksmen she'd encountered in 23 years of service. But Colonel Williams wasn't sitting across from Lieutenant Harrison during Sarah's interview at Riverside PD. Harrison was a 20-year veteran of the force, a former Marine who'd built the tactical team from nothing into what he considered an elite unit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair cut in a precise fade, and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything as either useful or disposable. When Sarah sat down in his office that February morning, she could feel his skepticism radiating across the desk like heat from a furnace. The interview had started professionally enough. Harrison reviewed her military record, asked standard questions about her transition to civilian life, and discussed the technical requirements of police sniper work. Sarah answered each query with the kind of measured precision her Army training had instilled. She explained how civilian rules of engagement differed from military operations, demonstrated her knowledge of less lethal options, and discussed the psychological challenges of potentially shooting fellow citizens rather than enemy combatants. Then Harrison leaned back in his chair and delivered what Sarah would later recognize as a test designed to make her fail. He described a hypothetical scenario involving a hostage situation downtown, with civilians in the line of fire and media. Attention complicating every decision. The shot would be through glass, at a moving target, with innocent lives hanging in the balance. How would she handle the pressure, knowing that one mistake could end her career and possibly result in civilian casualties? Sarah had taken a breath and walked Harrison through her mental process. She discussed angle calculations, the physics of shooting through different types of glass, the importance of understanding backstop trajectories, and the psychological preparation required for high-stakes shots. She mentioned specific techniques for managing stress and maintaining focus under extreme pressure. Her answers were thorough, technical, and demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise Harrison claimed he wanted. His response had been a dismissive nod and a comment that military snipers operated in war zones where mistakes were just part of the cost of doing business. Civilian police work required a different mindset, he explained, one that prioritized de-escalation and treated every life as precious. The implication was clear. Sarah might be able to hit targets, but she lacked the judgment and restraint necessary for police work. Sarah had felt her jaw tighten, but she'd maintained her composure. She explained that military snipers actually operated under stricter rules of engagement than many people realized, that every shot had to be justified and documented, and that the psychological weight of taking a life was something she understood better than most. She'd seen what happened when snipers made poor decisions, and she'd been trained to avoid those mistakes. Harrison had seemed unimpressed. He'd mentioned that the department already had 2 qualified snipers, both former military like herself, and that adding a 3rd person to the rotation would require significant training investment. Budget constraints meant they needed to be selective about new hires, particularly for specialized positions. He'd thanked Sarah for her interest and said they'd be in touch. The call came 3 weeks later, but not from Harrison. Captain Jennifer Walsh, a 15-year veteran who supervised patrol operations, had reviewed Sarah's application and been impressed by her qualifications. The department was expanding their community policing initiatives and needed officers with diverse backgrounds and strong communication skills. Captain Walsh had spoken with Sarah's references, including Colonel Williams, and decided to offer Sarah a position as a patrol officer with the possibility of joining the tactical team. After proving herself in civilian law enforcement, Sarah had accepted immediately, understanding that this was her foot in the door. She'd proven herself before, and she could do it again. What she hadn't anticipated was how long and frustrating that process would become, or how much resistance she'd face from the very people she was trying to help. Her first partner had been Detective Mike Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran with a reputation for being both highly competent and refreshingly straightforward. Mike was the kind of cop who evaluated people based on their actions rather than their backgrounds, and he'd quickly recognized Sarah's potential. During their first week together, they'd responded to a domestic violence call where the suspect had barricaded himself in an upstairs bedroom with a rifle. While other officers established a perimeter, Sarah had used her military experience to assess the tactical situation and provide valuable intelligence about the suspect's likely positions and lines of sight. Mike had been impressed by Sarah's calm analysis and tactical thinking. He'd started recommending her for situations that required precision and steady nerves. When they responded to a jumper threatening to leap from the Riverside Bridge, Sarah's patient communication skills had helped talk the man down. During a high-speed pursuit that ended in a crash, her first aid training had kept an injured suspect alive until paramedics arrived. Mike began mentioning Sarah's capabilities to other supervisors, building a case for her advancement. But Lieutenant Harrison remained unconvinced. During Sarah's 6-month review, he'd acknowledged her solid patrol work while questioning whether she had the temperament for tactical operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd mentioned concerns about her military background, creating unrealistic confidence in high-stress situations. The review felt like a masterclass in damning with faint praise, and Sarah had left the meeting feeling frustrated but not defeated. The breakthrough had come during a barricaded suspect situation at a downtown apartment complex. A man armed with a hunting rifle had fired several shots from his third-floor window before holing up inside his unit. The tactical team had been called, but their primary sniper was attending training in Denver, and their backup was recovering from knee surgery. Harrison had reluctantly agreed to let Sarah provide overwatch while they attempted to negotiate with the suspect. Sarah had positioned herself on a rooftop across the street, with Detective Rodriguez serving as her spotter. The suspect periodically appeared at different windows, sometimes pointing his rifle toward the street where officers and civilians were taking cover. Sarah maintained her position for 4 hours, tracking the suspect's movements and providing detailed intelligence to the command post. When negotiations finally succeeded and the suspect surrendered peacefully, Sarah had contributed crucial information that helped keep everyone safe. Harrison's debriefing had been grudgingly positive. Sarah's tactical awareness and communication had been professional, and her restraint in not taking unnecessary shots had demonstrated good judgment. But he'd also emphasized that this was just one situation, and that building trust in tactical operations required consistent performance over time. The message was clear. Sarah would need to prove herself repeatedly before being considered for full team membership. That pattern had continued for months. Sarah would excel in challenging situations, receive measured praise, and then face new questions about her readiness for increased responsibility. She'd volunteered for additional training, studied tactics manuals during her off hours, and consistently demonstrated the skills Harrison claimed he wanted. But there always seemed to be another hurdle, another concern, another reason to wait. Just a little longer. The other officers had begun to notice the double standard. Tommy Brooks, a rookie officer who joined the department 6 months after Sarah, had been fast-tracked for detective training despite having no prior law enforcement experience. Meanwhile, Sarah was told she needed more seasoning before taking on additional responsibilities. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Some people had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. Captain Walsh had tried to intervene on Sarah's behalf, pointing out her exemplary record and consistent performance evaluations. During a supervisor's meeting, she'd argued that the department was wasting Sarah's specialized skills by keeping her in routine patrol assignments. Harrison had responded that tactical team selection required consensus from existing members, and that forcing the issue could undermine unit cohesion. Sarah had considered requesting a transfer to another department, but Riverside was her home. Her parents still lived here, and despite the professional frustrations, she believed in the community policing philosophy that Captain Walsh was implementing. She'd also developed strong working relationships with several colleagues who appreciated her skills and professionalism. Leaving would feel like admitting defeat, and Sarah had never been good at backing down from challenges. Instead, she'd focused on becoming the best officer she could be within her current role. She'd learned the names and stories of people on her beat, building trust with business owners and residents who initially viewed her with skepticism. Her arrest record was solid, her use of force incidents were minimal, and citizen complaints were non-existent. She'd become the kind of officer that supervisors assigned to sensitive situations, because they knew she would handle them professionally. During quiet moments on patrol, Sarah would sometimes think about her Army buddies who'd transitioned to civilian law enforcement in other cities. Most had found departments that valued their military experience and had been quickly integrated into specialized units. A few had even been recruited specifically for their sniper skills. Sarah wondered if she'd made a mistake staying in Riverside, where her background seemed more like a liability than an asset. But she'd also developed a stubborn determination to succeed on her own terms. Every small victory felt significant because it had been earned against resistance. When she'd successfully de-escalated a potential riot at a high school football game, the achievement meant more because colleagues who'd initially doubted her had witnessed her competence firsthand. When she'd tracked down a missing elderly man with dementia using techniques she'd learned in the military, the grateful family's thanks had validated her choice to stay and fight for recognition. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her military training had taught her patience as much as marksmanship. Snipers learn to wait for the right moment, to endure discomfort and frustration while maintaining focus on their ultimate objective. She'd applied that same mindset to her civilian career, understanding that proving herself would take time, but believing that competence would eventually overcome prejudice. As her 18-month anniversary with the department approached, Sarah had begun to see subtle changes in attitudes around her. Younger officers sought her advice on tactical situations, and even some veterans had started acknowledging her contributions to successful operations. Harrison still maintained his skeptical stance, but his criticism had become less frequent and more focused on specific tactical concerns, rather than general doubts about her capabilities. Sarah had also noticed that Harrison's resistance wasn't necessarily personal. He'd expressed similar reservations about other officers who didn't fit his traditional model of what a tactical team member should look like. The department was slowly changing, with more diverse hiring and evolving training standards, but Harrison represented an older generation of law enforcement that was struggling to adapt to those changes. The morning everything changed had started. Like any other day, Sarah was reviewing incident reports from the previous shift when Captain Walsh approached her desk with an unusual expression of concern mixed with opportunity. There had been a development in an ongoing investigation that might require specialized surveillance skills, and Sarah's military background made her an ideal candidate for the assignment. The details were sensitive, but it could finally be the chance Sarah had been waiting for to demonstrate her tactical capabilities in a real operational context. What neither Sarah nor Captain Walsh knew was that across town, Marcus Thompson was finalizing plans that would test every skill Sarah had developed over the past 8 years of military service and 18 months of civilian police work. By the end of that day, the question of whether Sarah belonged on the tactical team would be answered definitively, and Lieutenant Harrison's doubts would be rendered irrelevant by the harsh reality of a crisis that demanded her very best. Marcus Thompson had been planning the robbery for 3 months, studying the routines of First National Bank with the methodical precision of someone who understood that one mistake would cost him everything. At 34, he was a former construction foreman whose world had collapsed when his 8-year-old daughter Emma was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The medical bills had consumed his savings, forced him to mortgage his house twice, and eventually led to Emma's mother leaving with their son for California, unable to handle the financial and emotional pressure. Thompson wasn't a career criminal. He'd never even received a speeding ticket before Emma got sick. But watching his daughter suffer while insurance companies denied treatments and hospitals demanded payment upfront had transformed his desperation into something harder and more focused. He'd researched experimental therapies in Germany that could save Emma's life, treatments that cost $200,000 and weren't covered by any insurance plan. The bank held the mortgage on his house, the last asset he had left, and traditional loan applications had been rejected due to his mounting medical debt. On that Tuesday morning in October, Thompson had kissed Emma goodbye at Riverside General Hospital, where she was receiving her 4th round of chemotherapy. She'd smiled weakly and asked if he would bring her favorite chocolate chip cookies when he visited that evening. Thompson had promised he would, knowing it might be the last promise he'd ever make to her. He'd driven downtown in his faded blue pickup truck, parked 3 blocks from the bank, and walked inside carrying the duffel bag that contained a sawed-off shotgun and enough zip ties to secure every person in the building. Sarah Chen had been 3 miles away at Mountain View Training Facility, qualifying with her service weapon as part of her monthly requirements. She'd been shooting perfect scores all morning, placing tight groupings in the center of targets, at various distances while other officers struggled with the windy conditions. Detective Rodriguez had been spotting for her, making casual conversation between shooting strings about weekend plans and the new Italian restaurant that had opened near the courthouse. The call had come through at exactly 11:47 a.m., crackling through every radio in the building with the kind of urgency that made experienced officers drop what they were doing and listen. Armed robbery in progress at First National Bank. Shots fired, unknown number of hostages, suspect still inside and making demands. Sarah had been in the middle of reloading when the dispatcher's voice cut through the morning air, and she'd felt that familiar tightening in her chest that always preceded action. Rodriguez had looked at her with the expression of someone who knew that their quiet Tuesday morning had just become something much more complicated. Sarah had secured her weapon and gear with practiced efficiency, her mind already shifting into the tactical mode she'd learned to access during her military service. The drive back to headquarters had taken 12 minutes, during which they'd listened to increasingly concerning radio traffic about the situation at the bank. Lieutenant Harrison had been in the command center when Sarah and Rodriguez arrived, surrounded by maps, radio equipment, and the controlled chaos of a major incident response. He'd been coordinating with patrol units to establish a perimeter while trying to gather intelligence about what was happening inside the building. The initial reports had been fragmented and contradictory, as they always were during the first hour of a crisis, but certain facts were becoming clear. Thompson had entered the bank during the morning rush, when tellers were handling the daily influx of business customers and employees were preparing for their lunch breaks. He'd waited in line like any other customer until reaching the counter, where he'd quietly informed the teller that he had a weapon and needed her to remain calm. His approach had been almost apologetic, as if he was sorry for the inconvenience he was about to cause. The situation had escalated when a security guard noticed Thompson's unusual behavior and approached to investigate. Thompson had panicked, pulling out his shotgun and firing a warning shot into the ceiling that sent everyone in the building diving for cover. Plaster and dust had rained down on screaming customers as Thompson shouted for everyone to get on the ground and stay quiet. In the space of 30 seconds, what he'd planned as a quiet robbery had become a hostage situation. Dr. Amanda Foster had been at the bank to deposit a check from her pediatric practice when Thompson's shot shattered the morning calm. She'd dropped to the floor behind a desk as instructed, her medical training automatically assessing the injuries of other customers who'd been cut by falling debris. An elderly man had a laceration on his forehead, and a young mother was hyperventilating while trying to keep her twin toddlers quiet. Dr. Foster had been discreetly providing first aid when Thompson noticed her moving around and ordered her to stand by the window where he could watch her. Thompson's demands had been specific and desperate. He wanted the bank to transfer $200,000 to a medical facility in Munich, Germany, where his daughter could receive treatment that wasn't available in the United States. He'd done his research thoroughly, providing account numbers and wire transfer instructions with the precision of someone who'd spent months planning this moment. He wasn't asking for money to disappear or fund a lifestyle change. He was asking for his daughter's life. The bank manager, a nervous man named Robert Chun, had tried to explain that such a large wire transfer would require authorization from multiple levels of management, and federal banking regulations made immediate transfers impossible. Thompson had responded by pressing his shotgun against Dr. Foster's head and asking if regulations were more important than his daughter's life. The question had hung in the air like smoke, impossible to answer in any way that wouldn't escalate the situation. Harrison had been coordinating response efforts when Captain Walsh approached with a suggestion that made his jaw tighten with familiar frustration. Sarah Chen was at the training facility with her rifle and had demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills during recent qualifications. Given the developing nature of the situation and the possibility that sniper support might be needed, shouldn't they consider bringing her to the scene as backup? Harrison's initial response had been predictably negative. Sarah wasn't certified for tactical operations, hadn't been through hostage negotiation protocols, and lacked the experience to handle such a high-stakes situation. Captain Walsh had pressed the issue with the kind of gentle persistence that came from years of navigating departmental politics. Their primary sniper was still in Denver at training. Their backup was on medical leave, and the state police wouldn't arrive for at least 2 hours. If the situation deteriorated, they might need every resource available. Sarah could provide overwatch and intelligence gathering, even if she wasn't authorized to take action. Her military background included combat experience that most of their officers lacked, and her recent performance evaluations had been consistently excellent. The debate had been interrupted by increasingly urgent reports from patrol officers surrounding the bank. Thompson was becoming more agitated as bank employees explained the complexities of international wire transfers. He'd started pacing near the windows, dragging Dr. Foster with him while shouting about bureaucratic obstacles and his daughter's deteriorating condition. Witnesses inside the bank reported that he seemed more desperate than dangerous, but desperation could be just as deadly as malice when combined with a loaded weapon. Sarah had arrived at the command post 43 minutes after the initial call, carrying her gear bag and wearing the kind of focused expression that Rodriguez had learned to recognize during their partnership. She'd immediately approached the intelligence gathering station, studying building blueprints and witness statements while other officers briefed her on the developing situation. Her questions had been precise and tactical, focusing on sight lines, background considerations, and the physical layout that would affect any potential resolution. Harrison had watched Sarah's preparation with grudging acknowledgement of her professionalism, even as he maintained reservations about her involvement. She'd identified the optimal observation positions, calculated angles and distances, and demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that came from real-world experience rather than classroom theory. When she'd requested permission to establish an overwatch position on the building across from the bank, Harrison had found himself nodding approval despite his lingering doubts. The rooftop of Riverside Medical Center provided an elevated position with clear sight lines to the bank's fourth-floor windows, where most of the hostage situation was taking place. Sarah had climbed 6 flights of stairs carrying her equipment, emerging onto the roof with the kind of controlled breathing that indicated physical fitness rather than exertion. She'd quickly identified the best position, accounting for wind direction, potential background issues, and the angle required to see into the bank's interior. Setting up her rifle had taken less than 5 minutes, a process Sarah had performed hundreds of times under various conditions during her military service. The Remington 700 felt familiar in her hands, its weight and balance as comfortable as an extension of her own body. She'd adjusted the scope for distance and environmental conditions, then settled into a shooting position that she could maintain for hours if necessary. Through her earpiece, she'd reported to the command post that she had clear observation of the target area and could provide real-time intelligence about what was happening inside. Dr. Foster had been moved to different positions throughout the morning as Thompson's agitation increased. From her rooftop position, Sarah could see the fear in the pediatrician's face as she was used as a human shield during increasingly heated phone conversations between Thompson and bank officials. The other hostages remained on the floor, mostly out of Sarah's line of sight, but she could observe their movements when they shifted position or when Thompson ordered them to stay still. The negotiator, Detective Lisa Park, had been trying to establish communication with Thompson for over an hour when Sarah first observed him through her scope. She'd seen enough combat situations to recognize the difference between calculated violence and desperate panic, and Thompson clearly fell into the latter category. His movements were erratic rather than tactical, and he kept looking toward his phone as if expecting news that wasn't coming. Sarah had reported her observations to the command post, noting that the suspect appeared more frightened than aggressive. Thompson's phone calls to the hospital where his daughter was receiving treatment had become increasingly frantic as the morning progressed. Emma's condition was deteriorating faster than expected, and doctors were running out of conventional treatment options. The experimental therapy in Germany represented her only realistic chance for survival, but the window for beginning treatment was closing rapidly. Each delay in getting the money transferred brought his daughter closer to a point of no return that Thompson couldn't accept. Sarah had been observing for 2 hours when she noticed a change in Thompson's behavior that sent alarm signals through her trained instincts. His pacing had become more purposeful, his grip on the shotgun had tightened, and he'd begun looking out the window in a way that suggested he was preparing to take action. Through her earpiece, she'd reported to Detective Park that the suspect's demeanor was shifting from desperation to what appeared to be final resolve. The breaking point had come when Thompson received a call from his ex-wife in California. Emma had been asking for her father, wondering why he hadn't visited that morning, as he'd promised. The little girl didn't understand why the adults around her seemed so worried, or why her daddy wasn't there to read her stories and bring her cookies like he always did. Thompson's ex-wife had been crying as she explained that Emma was asking if her father didn't love her anymore, if that was why he'd stopped coming to see her. Sarah had watched through her scope as Thompson's composure finally shattered. He'd dropped to his knees while still holding Dr. Foster, pressing his face against the window as sobs racked his body. The sound of a grown man breaking down had carried across the street, audible even to the officers positioned around the building's perimeter. For several minutes, the only sounds had been Thompson's weeping and the quiet whimpering of terrified hostages who didn't know whether his emotional collapse made them safer or put them in greater danger. Detective Park had tried to use Thompson's vulnerability as an opening for negotiation, speaking in gentle tones about understanding his situation and wanting to help find a solution that didn't end in tragedy. She'd acknowledged his love for his daughter and expressed genuine empathy for the impossible situation that had driven him to such desperate measures. Her words had seemed to reach him initially, as his crying had slowed and he'd begun to respond to her questions about Emma's condition and treatment needs. But the moment of connection had been shattered when Thompson's phone rang again. This time it was the hospital's financial coordinator, calling to inform him that without immediate payment for Emma's current treatment, they would have to discharge her that afternoon. The insurance company had denied coverage for any additional chemotherapy, and the hospital's charity fund had been exhausted by other cases. Emma would have to leave, regardless of her medical condition, unless payment could be guaranteed within the next 6 hours. Sarah had seen the exact moment when Thompson's grief transformed into something harder and more dangerous. Through her scope, she'd watched his face change from despair to a kind of terrible clarity. He'd stood up slowly, pulling Dr. Foster with him, and moved to a position directly in front of the window. His voice had carried clearly across the street as he shouted that if his daughter was going to die because the system had failed her, then the system would have consequences to face. The final ultimatum had been delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. Thompson had given the bank exactly 1 hour to complete the wire transfer to the German medical facility. If the money wasn't sent by exactly 3 p.m., he would begin executing hostages, starting with Dr. Foster. He'd chosen her specifically because she was a doctor, someone who had sworn an oath to save lives, but worked within a system that let children die for lack of money. Harrison had been coordinating with federal negotiators when Thompson's deadline was announced, and the lieutenant's expression had shifted from controlled concern to barely contained alarm. 1 hour wasn't enough time to arrange the kind of complex financial transaction Thompson was demanding, even if the bank had been willing to comply with his demands. The FBI's hostage rescue team was still 90 minutes away, and local resources were limited to patrol officers and the equipment they had on scene. Sarah had been monitoring radio traffic while maintaining her observation position, listening to increasingly desperate discussions about options and alternatives. State police were en route but wouldn't arrive before Thompson's deadline. The bank's corporate headquarters was trying to work with federal regulators to expedite some kind of transfer, but bureaucratic processes weren't designed to function under hostage situation timelines. Every agency involved was doing their best, but everyone's best wasn't going to be enough to save the lives that hung in the balance. As the deadline approached, Sarah had noticed subtle changes in the tactical situation that weren't immediately obvious to officers positioned at street level. Thompson had moved Dr. Foster away from the other hostages, isolating her near the window where Sarah had a clear line of sight. His positioning suggested that he was serious about his threat to begin executing people, and his choice of Dr. Foster as the first victim wasn't random. He wanted the symbolic impact of killing someone whose profession was supposed to save lives. With 37 minutes remaining until Thompson's deadline, Detective Park had made one final attempt at negotiation. She'd offered to personally guarantee that Emma would receive the best possible care at Riverside General, using her own connections to ensure that money wouldn't be a barrier to treatment. She'd promised to work with social services and medical charities to find funding for the experimental therapy Thompson wanted for his daughter. Her offer had been genuine and heartfelt, backed by years of experience in finding resources for families in crisis. Thompson's response had been to press his shotgun more firmly against Dr. Foster's head, while explaining that promises were what had gotten his daughter into this situation in the first place. Insurance companies had promised coverage that was later denied. Hospitals had promised payment plans that became impossible to maintain. Government assistance programs had promised help that never materialized. He was done accepting promises from a system that had already failed his daughter too many times to count. Sarah had been calculating wind speeds and adjusting her scope settings when she heard Lieutenant Harrison's voice in her earpiece for the first time since establishing her position. His tone had carried the weight of a man facing impossible choices, acknowledging that conventional options were exhausted and unconventional measures might be their only remaining alternative. He'd asked Sarah for her assessment of a potential precision shot should it become necessary to prevent the execution of hostages. Her response had been measured and professional, reflecting both her military training and her understanding of the enormous responsibility being placed on her shoulders. The shot was technically feasible from her current position, with clear sight lines and favorable environmental conditions. However, she'd emphasized that any use of lethal force should be considered only as a last resort, when all other options had been exhausted and innocent lives were in immediate danger of being lost. Harrison had listened to Sarah's tactical assessment with growing awareness that his personal reservations about her abilities were becoming irrelevant in the face of operational necessity. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Federal resources wouldn't arrive in time, and the lives of 12 innocent people hung in the balance. His voice had been steady but strained as he'd authorized Sarah to prepare for potential lethal force, while emphasizing that the decision to shoot would require explicit authorization from the incident commander. As Thompson's deadline approached with mechanical inevitability, Sarah had felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down that always preceded moments of critical action. Through her scope, she could see Dr. Foster's terrified face and Thompson's finger resting on the trigger of his shotgun. The other hostages remained huddled on the floor, invisible to Sarah but undoubtedly aware that their lives depended on decisions being made by people they couldn't see and didn't know. The radio traffic had become increasingly urgent as 3 p.m. approached, with various agencies reporting their inability to meet Thompson's demands within his timeline. The wire transfer couldn't be completed without federal approval that wouldn't come in time. Emma's medical team was being notified that discharge procedures would begin as scheduled. Thompson's phone had been ringing continuously with calls from negotiators, bank officials, and medical personnel, but he'd stopped answering. After receiving confirmation that his daughter would be removed from treatment that afternoon, with 3 minutes remaining until his deadline, Thompson had stepped back from Dr. Foster and addressed the hostages in a voice that carried clearly across the street to where Sarah maintained her observation position. He'd apologized to them for involving them in his desperation, explaining that none of this was their fault, but that someone needed to be held accountable for a system that prioritized money over the life of a child. His words had been calm and measured, delivered with the terrible certainty of a man who believed he was about to die for his daughter's sake. The clock on the bank's wall showed 3:01 p.m. when Thompson raised his shotgun toward Dr. Foster's head, his hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of what he was about to do. Sarah watched through her scope as the pediatrician closed her eyes, her lips moving in what appeared to be a silent prayer. The other hostages had begun crying audibly, their sobs carrying across the street to where tactical officers crouched behind their vehicles, weapons drawn but useless at this distance. Detective Park's voice had become increasingly desperate in her final attempts at negotiation, offering everything from personal financial assistance to connections with experimental treatment programs across the country. Her words tumbled over each other in a rush to fill the silence that preceded violence, but Thompson had stopped responding to her calls. His phone lay discarded on a desk beside him, its screen dark and lifeless like the hope that had driven him to this moment. Lieutenant Harrison's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece with the kind of controlled tension that indicated a man operating at the edge of his training and experience. The federal negotiators had exhausted their protocols. The bank had reached the limits of their emergency procedures, and the hospital was proceeding with Emma's discharge despite the unfolding crisis. Every system that should have provided alternatives had failed, leaving a desperate father with a loaded weapon and nothing left to lose. Sarah had been motionless in her shooting position for over 3 hours, her body locked into the kind of steady stillness that military snipers learn to maintain, regardless of physical discomfort or psychological pressure. Her breathing had settled into the rhythm she'd practiced thousands of times during training and combat operations, each exhalation timed to the natural pause between heartbeats when her body achieved maximum stability. Through her scope, she could see the individual threads in Thompson's flannel shirt and count the tears on Dr. Foster's cheeks. The wind had been shifting throughout the afternoon, requiring constant adjustments to Sarah's calculations as gusts swirled around the downtown buildings in unpredictable patterns. She'd been monitoring weather conditions with the same attention to detail that had kept her alive during 3 combat deployments, noting how the air currents changed with the sun's angle and the temperature differential between the heated pavement below and the cooler air at rooftop level. A shot at this distance would require perfect timing to account for the crosswind that could push a bullet several inches off target. Thompson had begun speaking to himself in a voice too quiet for the listening devices to pick up clearly, but Sarah could read his lips through the high-powered scope. He was talking to his daughter, telling Emma that Daddy was going to make sure she got the medicine she needed, that the bad people who were keeping her from getting better would understand what it felt like to lose someone precious. His face was streaked with tears, but his grip on the shotgun remained steady as he prepared to follow through on his ultimatum. Dr. Foster had opened her eyes and was looking directly at Thompson, her medical training apparently overriding her fear as she tried to establish some kind of human connection with the man who was about to kill her. Sarah couldn't hear what the pediatrician was saying, but she could see Thompson's reaction to whatever words were being exchanged between them. His expression flickered between rage and anguish, the internal battle between desperation and humanity playing out in real time across his features. The tactical command post had descended into controlled chaos as Harrison coordinated with multiple agencies, while trying to manage a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. FBI negotiators were providing guidance over radio links. State police commanders were en route with additional resources, and hospital administrators were being pressured to delay Emma's discharge until the crisis could be resolved. But bureaucratic solutions moved at bureaucratic speeds, while Thompson's timeline was measured in heartbeats and final breaths. Sarah had been trained to compartmentalize emotions during critical moments, to separate the human cost of her actions from the tactical necessity of completing her mission. But watching Thompson's breakdown through her scope was testing those psychological barriers in ways that combat operations had never challenged. This wasn't an enemy soldier threatening her unit or a terrorist planning to harm civilians. This was a father willing to commit murder to save his daughter's life, and the moral complexity of that equation didn't fit neatly into the rules of engagement she'd memorized. Captain Walsh had arrived at the scene 45 minutes earlier, parking her patrol car at the outer perimeter and making her way to the command post through the maze of emergency vehicles and media crews that had gathered to document the unfolding tragedy. Her presence had provided Sarah with a familiar voice of support in her earpiece, someone who understood her capabilities and trusted her judgment even when others remained skeptical. Walsh had been quietly advocating for giving Sarah whatever authorization she needed to end the situation safely. The media presence had grown throughout the afternoon, with news helicopters circling overhead and reporters positioning themselves at every available vantage point around the bank. Sarah had been acutely aware that her actions would be recorded from multiple angles, analyzed by experts and amateurs alike, and judged by people who had never faced a life or death decision with seconds to make it. The scrutiny added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation, but she forced herself to focus on the tactical requirements rather than the political implications. Detective Rodriguez had positioned himself at the command post as Sarah's primary communication link, relaying intelligence from her rooftop position to the incident commanders while providing her with updates about negotiation efforts and tactical developments. His steady presence in her earpiece had been a source of comfort during the long hours of observation, reminding her that she wasn't alone on the rooftop despite the isolation of her position. Rodriguez understood the burden she was carrying and had been working to ensure she had everything needed to succeed if shooting became necessary. Thompson's phone had started ringing again at 3:07 p.m., the sound carrying clearly across the street through the broken bank window. Sarah could see him looking at the device with the kind of desperate hope that suggested he was still waiting for news that the money had been transferred, or that some last-minute miracle had saved his daughter's treatment. When he finally answered, his face had gone through a series of expressions that told a story more clearly than any words could have conveyed. The caller had been Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Emma's primary oncologist at Riverside General Hospital. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read Thompson's body language as he listened to what was clearly devastating news. His shoulders had sagged, his grip on the shotgun had loosened momentarily, and his free hand had covered his face in a gesture of absolute despair. Whatever Dr. Morrison was telling him had shattered the last fragments of hope that had been holding him together. Emma's condition had deteriorated more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. The chemotherapy that should have bought them time to arrange alternative treatment had instead triggered complications that were beyond the hospital's ability to manage. Dr. Morrison was calling to inform Thompson that his daughter was being moved to intensive care and that her prognosis had changed from guarded to critical. Even if the German treatment had been approved and funded that very moment, Emma was no longer stable enough to travel. Sarah watched through her scope as Thompson processed the news that his desperate gamble had already failed. The hostages he was threatening to kill couldn't save his daughter because nothing could save his daughter. The money he was demanding had become irrelevant because the window for treatment had closed, while he'd been pointing a gun at innocent people. His entire reason for being in that bank had evaporated, but the situation he'd created remained dangerously real. The transformation in Thompson's demeanor had been immediate and terrifying. The desperate hope that had driven his actions for hours had been replaced by something much darker and more unpredictable. He dropped his phone without ending the call, leaving Dr. Morrison's voice echoing in the empty air as she tried to continue providing medical updates about Emma's condition. His grip on the shotgun had tightened again, but now he was holding it with the resigned determination of a man who had nothing left to accomplish except causing pain proportional to his own. Dr. Foster had apparently sensed the shift in Thompson's mental state because she'd begun speaking more urgently, her voice rising enough to be picked up by the listening devices positioned around the building. She was telling Thompson about her own patients, children she'd treated who had faced similar diagnoses and overcome them, families who had found hope even in the darkest circumstances. Her words were professionally compassionate, but personally desperate, the voice of someone trying to save her own life by appealing to whatever humanity remained in her captor. Lieutenant Harrison had been monitoring radio communications from multiple agencies when the call came through from the hospital confirming Emma's deteriorating condition. The news had eliminated the theoretical possibility of meeting Thompson's demands while creating an even more dangerous tactical situation. A hostage-taker with achievable goals could potentially be negotiated with, but a man who had lost everything he was fighting for represented an entirely different kind of threat. Sarah had continued her observations while listening to increasingly urgent discussions between incident commanders about changing tactical priorities. With negotiation essentially impossible and Thompson's mental state becoming more unstable, the focus had shifted from peaceful resolution to damage limitation. The primary objective was now preventing him from carrying out his threat to execute hostages, even if that meant using lethal force to stop him. The authorization Sarah had been waiting for came at 3:14 p.m., delivered in Harrison's voice with the weight of command decision behind it. She was cleared to take the shot if Thompson made any move to harm the hostages, with the understanding that 12 innocent lives depended on her accuracy and judgment. The responsibility was enormous, but Sarah had been trained for exactly this kind of moment during 8 years of military service and 18 months of waiting to prove herself worthy of such trust. Through her scope, Sarah could see Thompson raising the shotgun toward Dr. Foster's head again, his movements more deliberate than desperate, now that he understood the futility of his position. The pediatrician had stopped trying to reason with him and was simply standing still, her professional composure intact even as she faced imminent death. The other hostages had gone quiet, perhaps sensing that the final act of their ordeal was about to begin. Sarah's finger found the trigger of her Remington 700, the familiar pressure point that had become as natural as breathing during countless hours of training and operational experience. She'd made similar shots under more difficult conditions, during combat operations, but never with so many civilians in such close proximity to the target. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of missing or hitting an unintended target would be catastrophic. The wind had steadied momentarily, providing a brief window of stable atmospheric conditions that Sarah recognized as her best opportunity for an accurate shot. She'd been tracking the air currents for hours and knew that the current lull wouldn't last long before the next gust disturbed her calculations. Through her earpiece, she could hear Harrison asking for her assessment of the shot, wanting confirmation that she could make it cleanly before giving final authorization. Thompson had positioned himself directly behind Dr. Foster, using her body as a shield while keeping his shotgun pressed against her head in a way that made any shot extremely difficult. Sarah would have to thread the bullet through a gap of perhaps 6 inches, accounting for both subjects potentially moving at the moment of trigger pull. The technical challenge was at the outer limits of what was possible even for someone with her level of training and experience. Dr. Foster had begun speaking again, her voice carrying clearly across the street as she made what appeared to be a final plea for the lives of everyone in the building. She was telling Thompson about the children in her practice who still needed her care, about parents who trusted her to save their sons and daughters from the same kind of illness that was taking Emma away. Her words weren't begging for mercy, but appealing to Thompson's understanding of what it meant to love a child desperately enough to do anything to save them. Sarah had been listening to Dr. Foster's words while maintaining her sight picture, and she realized that the pediatrician was deliberately trying to position herself in a way that would give Sarah a clearer shot. The doctor couldn't know that a sniper was watching from across the street, but her medical training had taught her to assess situations quickly and take whatever action might improve outcomes for everyone involved. She was risking Thompson's anger to create an opportunity for rescue that she couldn't even be sure existed. The moment of decision came at 3:18 p.m. when Thompson's phone rang one final time. Sarah could see him looking at the device with an expression of confused hope, as if he'd forgotten that there was no good news left for anyone to deliver. When he'd answered, his face had gone through one last transformation that eliminated any remaining doubt about his intentions. Emma had died while he was threatening to kill innocent people in her name. Dr. Morrison's voice had been barely audible through the phone speaker, but Sarah could read Thompson's reaction to the news that his daughter's fight was finally over. 8 years old, dead from a disease that might have been treatable if money hadn't been a barrier to care. Thompson's grief had transformed into rage so pure and focused that Sarah could see it radiating from his body like heat from a furnace. Dr. Foster was no longer a hostage in his mind. She was a symbol of everything that had failed his daughter. The shotgun had begun moving toward Dr. Foster's head with mechanical inevitability, Thompson's finger tightening on the trigger as he prepared to make someone else's family experience the loss he was feeling. Sarah had tracked the weapon's movement through her scope, her own finger resting on her rifle's trigger as she waited for Harrison's final authorization to take the shot. The distance was 347 yards. The wind was gusting at 8 miles per hour from the northwest, and she had perhaps 3 seconds before Thompson fired. Harrison's voice had cut through the radio chatter with absolute clarity and finality. "Take the shot." 2 words that ended the debate about Sarah's qualifications and began the process that would either save 12 lives or add to the day's tragedy. Sarah had exhaled slowly, allowing her body to reach the natural respiratory pause where her pulse was momentarily still and her muscles achieved maximum stability. The crosshairs had settled on the small portion of Thompson's head that was visible. Behind Dr. Foster's shoulder, a target area roughly the size of a coffee cup at a distance that would challenge even experienced snipers under ideal conditions. Sarah had been trained to make this shot, had practiced it hundreds of times during her military service, but never with so much depending on perfect execution. The margin for error was measured in millimeters, and anything less than absolute precision would result in innocent death. Through her scope, Sarah could see Thompson's face contorted with grief and rage as he prepared to pull the trigger that would end Dr. Foster's life and begin his own final confrontation with law enforcement officers who surrounded the building. His daughter was dead, his desperate gamble had failed, and he was about to ensure that other families shared his loss. The logic of his actions made no sense to anyone, except a man whose world had collapsed around the hospital bed of an 8-year-old girl. Sarah's world had narrowed to the small circle of her rifle scope, where wind calculations and bullet trajectory intersected with human tragedy and moral complexity. She'd been trained to separate emotion from execution, to focus on the technical aspects of marksmanship rather than the human cost of her actions. But this shot carried weight that no amount of training could completely prepare her for. Thompson wasn't an enemy soldier or a terrorist. He was a grieving father whose love for his daughter had driven him to become something he'd never intended to be. The trigger pull that would end Marcus Thompson's life began with the slightest pressure from Sarah's index finger. a motion so small that it was barely perceptible even to her. Through her scope, she could see Dr. Foster's eyes closed in prayer or resignation, Thompson's finger tightening on his shotgun's trigger, and the other hostages huddled on the floor in various states of terror and despair. In 3 seconds, either the pediatrician would be dead or Thompson would be, and Sarah's decision would determine which outcome became reality. Detective Rodriguez's voice had been steady in her earpiece as he provided final wind readings and confirmed that she had clear background beyond her target. Captain Walsh was monitoring from the command post. Lieutenant Harrison was watching through binoculars, and somewhere in the city, Emma Thompson's body was growing cold in a hospital room where her father would never again read her bedtime stories or bring her chocolate chip cookies. The weight of all those lives and all those relationships had compressed into the space between Sarah's finger and the trigger that would end the standoff. Sarah's finger applied the final ounce of pressure to the trigger at exactly 3:19 p.m. The moment when Thompson's shotgun had begun its final arc toward Dr. Foster's head. The Remington 700 kicked against her shoulder with familiar authority, sending a 168-grain hollow-point bullet across 347 yards of downtown Riverside air at 2,650 feet per second. The sound of the shot echoed off the surrounding buildings like thunder, drowning out the screams from inside the bank as everyone processed what had just happened. Through her scope, Sarah watched Marcus Thompson's body crumple to the floor. Beside the window, the shotgun falling from his lifeless hands to clatter across the tile surface, Dr. Foster had dropped to her knees, her hands pressed against her ears as she tried to comprehend that she was still alive while the man who had been about to kill her lay motionless 3 feet away. The other hostages had begun crying with relief and terror, their voices creating a chorus of human emotion that carried clearly across the street to Sarah's position. The bullet had struck Thompson exactly where Sarah had aimed, entering through the left side of his skull and ending his life instantly. There had been no suffering, no prolonged agony that would have added to the tragedy that had already consumed his family. One moment he had been a grieving father driven to desperation by a system that had failed his daughter, and the next he was simply gone, leaving behind a legacy of love twisted into violence by circumstances beyond his control. Lieutenant Harrison's voice had come through Sarah's earpiece immediately after the shot, his tone carrying a mixture of relief and professional acknowledgement that surprised her with its warmth. Confirmed target down, hostages appear secure. Outstanding work, Chun. The words were simple, but they carried weight that Sarah had been waiting to hear for 18 months. Her marksmanship had been validated under the most demanding circumstances possible, and even Harrison couldn't maintain his skepticism in the face of such definitive proof of her capabilities. The tactical team had moved into the bank within 90 seconds of Sarah's shot, their entry coordinated and efficient as they secured the scene and began evacuating hostages. Dr. Foster had required assistance walking due to shock and the physical strain of being held at gunpoint for hours, but she was uninjured beyond minor cuts from the ceiling debris that had fallen during Thompson's initial warning shot. The other hostages were similarly shaken but physically unharmed, their ordeal finally over after nearly 5 hours of terror. Sarah had remained in her shooting position until receiving explicit orders to stand down, maintaining observation of the scene while tactical officers processed the aftermath of her intervention. Through her scope, she had watched paramedics examine Thompson's body with the kind of professional detachment that emergency responders develop to cope with tragedy. There was nothing they could do for him, but their protocols required them to attempt resuscitation, even when the outcome was obviously predetermined. The media response had been immediate and overwhelming, with news helicopters circling closer to get footage of the sniper position and reporters already crafting narratives about the female police officer who had ended the standoff with a single shot. Sarah had been aware of the attention but focused on following proper procedures for post-incident protocols. securing her weapon and preparing to face the inevitable investigation and debriefing that followed any use of lethal force. Captain Walsh had been the first supervisor to reach Sarah's rooftop position, arriving with an evidence technician to document the scene while providing the kind of personal support that Sarah needed in the immediate aftermath of taking a life. Walsh's presence had been both official and compassionate, acknowledging the professional necessity of Sarah's actions while recognizing the personal cost of making such decisions. Her first words had been simple but meaningful. "You saved 12 lives today, Sarah. Don't forget that." The climb down 6 flights of stairs had given Sarah time to process what had just happened and prepare for the scrutiny that would follow. Every use of lethal force by a police officer triggered automatic investigations by multiple agencies, with her actions subject to review by Internal Affairs, the District Attorney's Office, and potentially federal authorities if civil rights violations were alleged. Sarah understood these procedures were necessary to maintain public trust, but they added stress to an already traumatic situation. Detective Rodriguez had been waiting in the lobby of the medical center when Sarah emerged from the stairwell, his familiar presence providing emotional support during the transition from tactical operations back to normal police work. He had witnessed the aftermath of Sarah's shot from the command post and understood better than most the complexity of what she had accomplished. His congratulations were genuine but subdued, recognizing that taking a life was never cause for celebration regardless of how necessary it might have been. The initial debriefing had taken place at police headquarters with Lieutenant Harrison, Captain Walsh, and a representative from the district attorney's office reviewing the circumstances that had led to the use of lethal force. Sarah had recounted her observations of Thompson's behavior, the tactical considerations that had influenced her shot placement, and the specific moment when she had determined that deadly force was necessary to prevent the execution of hostages. Her account had been detailed, professional, and completely consistent with radio recordings and witness statements. Harrison's assessment of Sarah's performance during the debriefing had been unqualifiedly positive, a stark contrast to the skepticism he had expressed throughout her 18 months with the department. He had praised her tactical awareness, her restraint in waiting for explicit authorization before shooting, and her technical skill in making an extremely difficult shot under challenging conditions. The lieutenant who had once questioned whether Sarah belonged in law enforcement was now recommending her for departmental commendations. The investigation into Thompson's background had revealed the full extent of the tragedy that had driven him to such desperate measures. Emma Thompson had indeed died that afternoon, her small body finally succumbing to the leukemia that had ravaged her system for 8 months. The experimental treatment her father had been trying to fund might have saved her life, but insurance, complications, and bureaucratic delays had made it impossible to access in time. Thompson's actions had been inexcusable, but the circumstances that had driven him to them were heartbreakingly understandable. Dr. Foster had requested to speak with Sarah during the evening following the incident, wanting to personally thank the officer who had saved her life and those of her fellow hostages. The meeting had taken place in a quiet conference room at the hospital, with Dr. Foster still visibly shaken, but determined to express her gratitude for Sarah's intervention. Her words had been simple but profound. "I have 3 children of my own, and they still have their mother because of what you did today." The conversation with Dr. Foster had provided Sarah with perspective on the human impact of her actions that went beyond the tactical success of ending the hostage situation. The pediatrician had spent her career saving children's lives, and Sarah's shot had ensured that Dr. Foster would continue that work for years to come. The ripple effects of preventing one tragedy would extend to countless other families who would benefit from Dr. Foster's medical expertise in the future. The media coverage of the incident had focused heavily on Sarah's background as a female sniper who had overcome institutional skepticism to prove her capabilities when it mattered most. Reporters had interviewed law enforcement experts who praised her marksmanship while discussing the challenges faced by women entering traditionally male-dominated tactical roles. Sarah had declined most interview requests, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves rather than becoming a symbol or spokesperson for any particular cause. Lieutenant Harrison had approached Sarah 3 days after the incident with an offer that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. The tactical team needed a permanent third sniper to provide coverage during training rotations and complex operations, and Sarah's performance during the bank standoff had demonstrated that she possessed the skills and judgment necessary for such responsibilities. The position would come with additional training, specialized equipment, and the kind of recognition that Sarah had been seeking since joining the department. Sarah's acceptance of the tactical team position had been immediate and enthusiastic, representing the culmination of 18 months of patient persistence in the face of institutional resistance. Her military experience had finally been recognized as an asset rather than a liability, and her gender was no longer seen as a barrier to performing demanding tactical roles. The offer had validated not just her marksmanship skills, but her overall judgment and professionalism under extreme pressure. The formal ceremony recognizing Sarah's actions had taken place 2 weeks after the incident, with Chief Martinez presenting her with the department's Medal of Valor while her parents and colleagues watched from the audience. The citation had praised her courage, skill, and dedication to protecting innocent lives even when facing skepticism about her abilities. The ceremony had represented more than individual recognition. It had acknowledged the changing nature of law enforcement and the value of diverse perspectives in solving complex problems. Dr. Foster had attended the ceremony as a guest speaker, sharing her perspective as someone whose life had been saved by Sarah's intervention. Her remarks had been emotional but professional, describing the terror of being held hostage while praising the skill and courage of the officer who had ended her ordeal. Dr. Foster's presence had provided tangible evidence of the positive impact that Sarah's actions had achieved, putting a human face on what might otherwise have been viewed as just another police shooting. The ripple effects of Sarah's successful intervention had extended far beyond her personal career advancement. The incident had prompted discussions about recruitment and training practices throughout the department, with supervisors examining whether qualified candidates were being overlooked due to unconscious biases or outdated assumptions. Captain Walsh had been tasked with reviewing selection criteria for specialized positions to ensure that all officers had fair opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. Sarah's new role on the tactical team had involved extensive additional training designed to integrate her military experience with civilian law enforcement protocols. The program had covered everything from updated rules of engagement to advanced tactical medicine, ensuring that her transition from military to police sniper would be complete and seamless. Her instructors had been impressed by her adaptability and her ability to apply lessons learned from combat operations to domestic law enforcement situations. The relationship between Sarah and Lieutenant Harrison had evolved significantly in the weeks following the bank incident, with mutual respect replacing the skepticism that had characterized their earlier interactions. Harrison had privately acknowledged that his resistance to Sarah's advancement had been based on outdated assumptions rather than legitimate concerns about her abilities. Their working relationship had become genuinely collaborative, with Harrison seeking Sarah's input on tactical planning and training scenarios. Detective Rodriguez had been promoted to sergeant partly based on his effective partnership with Sarah and his support for her advancement within the department. His willingness to advocate for qualified colleagues, regardless of their background, had been noted by supervisors who valued officers capable of recognizing talent and potential in others. The promotion had validated Rodriguez's judgment, while providing him with greater influence over departmental culture and practices. The training facility where Sarah had been qualifying when the bank crisis began had become a regular destination for her ongoing professional development as a tactical team member. The range where she had demonstrated consistent marksmanship skills during routine qualifications had been expanded to include more challenging scenarios designed to test officers under stress. Sarah had become an instructor for some of these programs, sharing her expertise with other officers while continuing to refine her own abilities. Captain Walsh had been selected to lead a regional task force examining best practices for integrating military veterans into civilian law enforcement roles, partly based on her successful mentorship of Sarah's career development. The assignment had recognized Walsh's ability to identify and nurture talent while addressing systemic barriers that might prevent qualified candidates from reaching their full potential. Her work would influence policies affecting veteran recruitment and retention throughout the state. The German medical facility where Emma Thompson might have received treatment had established a scholarship fund in her memory, providing financial assistance for other children whose families faced similar obstacles in accessing experimental therapies. The fund had been created with donations from law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and community members who had been moved by the tragedy that had unfolded at the bank. Emma's death had prompted positive changes that would help other families avoid similar desperation. Sarah's parents had attended every public ceremony recognizing their daughter's service, their pride evident but tempered by their understanding of the emotional cost of her chosen profession. They had supported her military service and her transition to law enforcement, despite their concerns about the dangers inherent in both careers. Their presence at departmental events had provided Sarah with family support while demonstrating to her colleagues that she came from a strong foundation of values and commitment. The security camera footage from the bank had been analyzed extensively by law enforcement trainers, who used the incident as a case study in crisis negotiation and tactical response. Sarah's patient observation and precise shot had become textbook examples of proper sniper employment in hostage situations. The footage was used in training programs across multiple agencies, ensuring that her successful intervention would influence law enforcement practices far beyond Riverside. The community response to the incident had been overwhelmingly positive, with residents expressing gratitude for Sarah's actions while acknowledging the tragedy that had driven Thompson to such desperate measures. Local organizations had increased their support for families facing medical crises, hoping to prevent future situations where desperation might lead to violence. The incident had sparked conversations about healthcare accessibility and the social safety net that might have prevented Thompson's breakdown. Sarah's first assignment as an official member of the tactical team had come just 3 weeks after her ceremony, involving surveillance of suspected drug dealers who were believed to be armed and dangerous. Her role had been to provide overwatch during the arrest operation, ensuring that officers on the ground had sniper support if the situation escalated. The operation had concluded peacefully, but Sarah's presence had provided tactical commanders with confidence that they had all necessary resources available. The media attention surrounding Sarah's role in ending the bank standoff had gradually subsided as other stories captured public interest, but the professional recognition within law enforcement circles had continued to grow. She had been invited to speak at conferences and training seminars, sharing her insights about the transition from military to civilian operations while discussing the technical aspects of precision shooting under stress. These opportunities had established her reputation as an expert in tactical operations beyond her local department. The psychological counseling that was mandatory following any use of lethal force had helped Sarah process the emotional complexity of taking a life to save others. The counselor had been experienced in working with law enforcement officers and military veterans, understanding the unique stresses faced by people whose jobs sometimes required them to make life or death decisions in seconds. The sessions had provided Sarah with tools for managing the psychological aftermath of her actions while maintaining her operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Harrison had privately visited Thompson's grave on the anniversary of Emma's death, leaving flowers while reflecting on the tragedy that had brought out both the worst and best in people involved in the incident. His gesture had been personal rather than official, representing his own process of understanding how good people could be driven to terrible actions by circumstances beyond their control. The visit had provided closure while reinforcing his commitment to fair treatment of all officers under his command. 2 years later, Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the International Law Enforcement Training Conference in Denver, looking out at an audience of tactical officers, supervisors, and instructors from agencies across North America. The presentation she was about to deliver would focus on precision shooting in urban environments, but her real message was about the importance of recognizing talent regardless of where it comes from or what package it arrives in. The conference hall was packed with seasoned professionals who had come to learn from the officer, whose single shot had not only ended a hostage crisis, but had also challenged assumptions about capabilities and qualifications that had persisted in law enforcement for decades. Sarah's reputation had spread far beyond Riverside, with her techniques and decision-making process being studied by tactical teams throughout the country. Her presentation began with the technical aspects of the shot that had made her famous. But Sarah quickly moved beyond ballistics and environmental factors to discuss the broader implications of the incident. She talked about the 18 months of preparation that had preceded those crucial seconds, emphasizing that excellence wasn't achieved through a single moment of performance, but through consistent dedication to improvement even when others doubted the value of that effort. The audience listened intently as Sarah described the psychological challenges of maintaining confidence while facing institutional skepticism, drawing parallels between her experience and similar situations that many attendees had witnessed in their own agencies. Her words carried authority not just because of her technical expertise, but because she had proven her capabilities under the most demanding circumstances possible. During the question and answer session that followed her formal presentation, a veteran sergeant from Phoenix asked about the moment she had decided to pull the trigger, wanting to understand the mental process that had led to such decisive action. Sarah's response was measured and thoughtful, acknowledging the weight of taking a life while emphasizing that hesitation in that situation would have resulted in multiple innocent deaths. A female officer from Seattle raised her hand to ask about overcoming gender-based skepticism in tactical roles, and Sarah's answer resonated throughout the auditorium. She spoke about focusing on performance rather than politics, about letting actions speak louder than arguments, and about the importance of finding allies who recognize talent regardless of traditional expectations. Her advice was practical and encouraging without minimizing the real challenges that women faced in proving themselves in male-dominated specialties. The conference had been just one stop on a speaking circuit that had emerged organically as other agencies sought to learn from Riverside's experience with integrating military veterans and diversifying their tactical teams. Sarah had initially been reluctant to take on such a public role, preferring to focus on operational duties rather than becoming a symbol or spokesperson. But Captain Walsh and Chief Martinez had convinced her that sharing her insights could help other qualified officers avoid some of the obstacles she had faced. Her speaking engagements had led to consulting opportunities with departments that were struggling to modernize their recruitment and selection processes. Sarah worked with agencies to review their training standards, identify potential sources of unconscious bias, and develop more objective criteria for evaluating candidates for specialized positions. The work was fulfilling because it addressed systemic issues rather than just individual cases of discrimination or overlooked talent. The Riverside Police Department had undergone significant changes in the 2 years since the bank incident, with Sarah's success serving as a catalyst for broader reforms in how the agency identified and developed talent. The tactical team had expanded to include 5 snipers, with 2 additional positions filled by officers whose backgrounds might have been dismissed under previous selection criteria. The team's performance metrics had improved across all measures, validating the wisdom of casting a wider net when recruiting for specialized roles. Lieutenant Harrison had retired 6 months earlier, but not before personally recommending Sarah for promotion to sergeant and assignment as the tactical team's primary training coordinator. His retirement ceremony had included a public acknowledgement of how the bank incident had changed his perspective on leadership and the importance of recognizing talent in all its forms. His endorsement of Sarah's advancement had carried particular weight because everyone knew about his initial skepticism. Sarah's promotion to sergeant had come with responsibility for training new tactical team members, a role that allowed her to ensure that future candidates would be evaluated fairly and thoroughly, regardless of their backgrounds. Her training programs emphasized technical competence and sound judgment, while fostering an inclusive culture that valued diverse perspectives and experiences. The team's cohesion had actually improved as it became more diverse, with different backgrounds, contributing to more comprehensive tactical planning. The relationship between Sarah and her colleagues had evolved from grudging acceptance to genuine respect and camaraderie over the months following her advancement to the tactical team. Officers who had initially questioned her qualifications had become advocates for her approach to training and operations. The team's success rate had improved significantly under her influence, with more complex situations being resolved without casualties. Dr. Amanda Foster had become a close friend and occasional consultant to the police department, providing medical expertise during tactical planning while serving as a powerful advocate for the officers who had saved her life. Her relationship with Sarah had deepened beyond gratitude to genuine friendship, with their families gathering regularly for dinners and social events. Dr. Foster's medical practice had thrived in the years since the incident, allowing her to treat thousands of children who might have lost their pediatrician if Thompson's threat had been carried out. The scholarship fund established in Emma Thompson's memory had grown to provide assistance for over 40 families facing similar medical crises, with donations continuing to arrive from law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and community members who had been moved by the story. Sarah had become one of the fund's most active supporters, contributing both financially and through fundraising efforts that leveraged her public profile to generate awareness and donations. Marcus Thompson's family had eventually reached out to Sarah through intermediaries, wanting to express their gratitude that she had ended their loved one's suffering quickly and prevented him from becoming a mass murderer. The conversations had been difficult, but healing for everyone involved, acknowledging the tragedy that had driven Thompson to violence, while recognizing that Sarah's intervention had prevented an even greater catastrophe. Thompson's ex-wife had started a support group for families dealing with pediatric cancer, channeling her grief into efforts to help others navigate similar challenges. The training facility where Sarah had been qualifying when the crisis began had been renamed the Marcus and Emma Thompson Memorial Range, with a plaque acknowledging both the tragedy that had unfolded downtown and the importance of preparing officers to handle such situations with skill and compassion. The facility had become a model for other agencies, incorporating advanced simulation, technology, and psychological training that prepared officers for the complex moral and tactical challenges they might face. Captain Walsh had been promoted to deputy chief, with her successful mentorship of Sarah and other officers contributing to her advancement within the department's hierarchy. Her leadership had been instrumental in creating a culture that valued talent development and fair treatment regardless of officers' backgrounds or demographics. The changes she had implemented in Riverside were being studied and replicated by agencies throughout the region. Detective Rodriguez, now Lieutenant Rodriguez, had become Sarah's closest colleague and collaborator in developing new training protocols and tactical procedures. Their partnership had evolved from patrol work to specialized operations, with Rodriguez serving as Sarah's primary spotter during complex assignments. His early recognition of Sarah's potential and his willingness to advocate for her advancement had been validated by their continued success as a team. Sarah's parents had watched their daughter's transformation from frustrated patrol officer to respected tactical expert, with pride tempered by concern for her safety and well-being. They attended every public ceremony honoring her achievements, while privately worrying about the psychological toll of her high-stress profession. Their support had been unwavering throughout her career challenges and continued as she took on greater responsibilities and public visibility. The media attention that had initially focused on Sarah's role in ending the bank standoff had evolved into broader coverage of her work as a trainer and advocate for fair treatment in law enforcement. She had been featured in several professional publications and had appeared on national news programs discussing the integration of military veterans into civilian police work. Her media appearances were always professional and focused on policy issues rather than personal recognition. The community of Riverside had embraced Sarah as a local hero while understanding that her actions had emerged from tragedy that touched everyone involved. The annual memorial service for Emma Thompson had become a community event that raised funds for pediatric cancer research while honoring the memory of a child whose death had prompted positive changes. Sarah attended every memorial service, maintaining her connection to the human cost of the incident that had defined her career. The technical aspects of Sarah's famous shot continued to be studied by marksmanship instructors and tactical planners, who analyzed every element of her decision-making process and execution. The shot had become a textbook example of precision shooting under extreme pressure, with detailed reconstructions being used to train other officers in similar scenarios. Sarah's willingness to share the technical details of her actions had contributed to improved training standards across multiple agencies. The psychological counseling that had helped Sarah process the emotional aftermath of taking a life had led to her becoming an advocate for mental health resources within law enforcement. She regularly spoke with officers who had been involved in traumatic incidents, sharing her experience while encouraging them to seek professional help when needed. Her openness about the challenges of coping with lethal force encounters had helped reduce stigma and improve support for officers dealing with similar situations. The federal agencies that had initially been slow to respond to the bank crisis had later sought Sarah's input on developing rapid response protocols for similar incidents. Her insights about the importance of having qualified personnel immediately available had influenced policy changes that improved coordination between local and federal law enforcement during complex operations. The lessons learned from the Riverside incident had been incorporated into training programs at the national level. Sarah's expertise had also been sought by international law enforcement agencies, dealing with similar challenges and integrating diverse personnel into specialized roles. She had traveled to Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia as a consultant, sharing Riverside's experience while learning about different approaches to the same fundamental issues. These international connections had broadened her perspective, while confirming that the challenges she had faced were not unique to American law enforcement. The shooting range where Sarah continued to practice and train had become a destination for officers from other agencies who wanted to observe her techniques and learn from her experience. Her training sessions were open to qualified law enforcement personnel, with waiting lists extending months in advance. The informal network of officers who had trained with Sarah had become advocates for similar approaches to talent development within their own agencies. The legacy of Sarah's intervention at First National Bank extended far beyond the immediate lives that were saved that day. Her success had opened doors for other qualified officers who might have been overlooked under previous selection criteria, creating a ripple effect that improved law enforcement capabilities while advancing the cause of fair treatment. The changes she had prompted were institutional rather than merely personal, ensuring that her impact would continue long after her own career ended. The confidence that Sarah had gained from proving herself under the most demanding circumstances had transformed not just her professional relationships, but her approach to every challenge she faced. The 18 months of patient persistence that had preceded her moment of vindication had taught her that competence combined with determination could overcome almost any obstacle. That lesson had become central to her philosophy as both an operator and a leader. As Sarah concluded her presentation at the Denver conference, she looked out at an audience that included several officers who had trained under her guidance and were now serving successfully in tactical roles with their own agencies. Their presence reminded her that the true measure of her impact wasn't the famous shot that had made her reputation, but the ongoing work of ensuring that qualified officers received fair opportunities to serve in the roles where they could make their greatest contribution. The standing ovation that greeted the end of Sarah's presentation was more than professional courtesy. It was recognition from her peers that she had not only excelled in her chosen specialty, but had also helped make the law enforcement profession more inclusive and effective. Her journey from skeptically regarded patrol officer to respected expert and trainer demonstrated that talent could emerge from unexpected sources when given the opportunity to flourish. Walking off the stage, Sarah reflected on how different her life might have been if she had accepted the initial skepticism about her capabilities, or if she had chosen to transfer to an agency that might have recognized her potential more quickly. Her decision to stay and prove herself in Riverside had required patience and determination, but it had ultimately led to changes that benefited not just her own career, but the entire profession. The 2 years since the bank incident had validated every aspect of Sarah's approach to overcoming institutional resistance through consistent excellence and professional integrity. Her success had created opportunities for others, while establishing new standards for how law enforcement agencies should identify and develop talent. The shot that had saved 12 lives had also changed countless others by demonstrating that capabilities mattered more than assumptions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.